And we're going to do something a little different now than we have done at past forums. We're going to give you a chance to have some discussions with the people at your table. We're going to do a little bit more clicker work, and we're going to have a chance for you to talk to one another about some of these issues. So I'm going to introduce to you Martine Carcassonne. Martine heads up the Center for Public Deliberation at Colorado State University, and he's done work all over the region and throughout other parts of the U.S. trying to bring people together to talk civilly about difficult issues. So I'm going to turn it over to Martine.
Yeah, I noticed right when she said, we're going to let y'all talk to each other at your tables, there started to be a lot of movement and uncomfortable. But thank you, Mary Lou, for kind of having me here and be part of this conversation. I'm going to kind of cover just a little bit of thing here, try to keep it to about 10 minutes, and then so we can kind of go to this to small groups, but just to kind of set things up a little bit. As she said, I'm a communication professor at CSU. I started the CPD about 10 years ago. We serve as an impartial resource in Northern Colorado, trying to help our community have these kind of tough conversations. A big part of what I do is I actually train undergraduate students to be small group facilitators. So I do feel a little unarmed today, because normally I have one or two students at every single table that's going to help you have that conversation and work through that. But today's Friday, students are in class, and I don't have this many students to have one per table. So we're going to kind of rely on your own here. But when I started the CBD 10 years ago, my research has always been, how do we talk about tough issues? And in particular, why is it so hard? And it's turned into, at least the last 10 years, of a very much of a process focus. What happens when you have good process, and how can that change the way we talk about issues? So a lot of the work, probably about the last 8 years or so, really focuses on this notion of wicked problems that a lot of y'all probably already know about, or you certainly just heard about that, and then the conversation all day has tied into this. The really short definition of wicked problems, if you haven't heard the term, is that there's not a technical solution. There's not just a right and wrong, primarily because there's just a broad group of underlining values that are in tension with each other, and we have to kind of work through and muddle through, and we're never really going to solve that in some way. So as we've heard today, looking at the competing interests or the competing concerns about economics or the environment or municipalities or agriculture or recreation, not that those are necessarily zero-sum games, but they don't fit together very well. So we have to kind of struggle through, how do we go through that? From a communication perspective, the reason wicked problems are so tough is because we're not wired to deal with those. Our brains don't like to do that, and then our primary kind of ways of engaging each other, the dominant communication models, don't work very well for wicked problems. The loudest voices tend to be experts that know a whole bunch about one piece, or tend to be advocates that are very passionate about one piece, but that's not how wicked problems work, because they're inherently bringing all these pieces together. So for the last 10 years, the CBD has done quite a few projects trying to learn about process and constantly trying to figure out better ways of engaging people. You can kind of see on the bottom left, spring of 2011, we worked with Mary Lou and the CSU Water Center to kind of start the Poudre runs through it. We had a series of public lectures, and then I brought my students out to do some deliberations. From that, the work group kind of created, and then from the work group, this got created as we go through it. So within this context of all this work, then the 2016 election happened. Don't worry, I'm not going to get into the election, right? But I think we can all agree the quality of communication during the election, the divisiveness kind of blew up. And that really pushed me for about the last year to do this deep dive into research on social psychology, into brain science, and how do, why are we so polarized? And hopefully on the back end, how can we change the way we talk to each other and take advantage of this? So I'm going to spend kind of my last 6 minutes here just kind of reviewing some of the results from this research that I've been doing. I have a 66-page paper. I've got it on a flash drive if you want it. You can take it with you. But I'm going to cover in 6 minutes just some of the highlights, which are pretty interesting. And it's going to get a little depressing here for the first 4 minutes, but I'm going to bring it back, right? So there's a lot of bad news, but there's also some good news. And probably the most important kind of takeaway from this, to summarize before I jump in, is that process matters, which is actually the title of the paper. And that really bad process fuels polarization, and really good process can help us really manage it in a lot of ways. So what I've been learning, I've been reading lots of books, books like Particularly Irrational, The Hidden Forces That Shape Our Decision, Thinking Fast and Slow. This won a Nobel Prize, but it talks about how we're cognitive misers. We want to think fast. We want to kind of apply simple rules. We don't want to do the slow work. You're Not Smart, and 46 Other Ways You're Deluding Yourself. A Mind of Its Own, How Your Brain Distorts and Deceives. What makes your brain happy and why you should do the opposite, which is one of my favorites. And The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Also read a couple hundred kind of academic articles kind of going through. But my quick kind of overview of some of the things I learned. First, the problematic, we are wired to crave certainty and consistency. This is how our brains work. We want things to be simple. Once we make a tough decision, it's really hard to get us off that. Our mind plays all these tricks to kind of protect that position and kind of push back from people kind of trying to change it. We're suckers for the good versus evil narrative. This is, again, how our brain works. This is ingrained in us. I've got 3 little kids. I've watched lots of Disney movies over the years. And as I'm going through this research, I just realized all these movies I was feeding my children when they're little just kind of reinforce this basic assumption that it's all about good versus... And think about the evil characters in Disney, right? It's not that they're misunderstood, right? It's just they're just dark. They just want bad things. And I think we teach our kids any tough problem, there's just a bad person behind it we just need to get rid of, right? We are tribal. I think we know that, right? This election has shown that kind of more than anything. We prefer to gather around the like-minded. Curious, look around your table. Who are you sitting with as you walked in kind of today? But we'll get back to this tribal thing because there's some good in there too. For me, my background's in argumentation, like how do we make arguments and what evidence and those type of things. But we filter and cherry pick evidence to support our views is one of the really interesting things that research comes in, right? That's one of the tricks our minds play, is that we feel that we're educating ourselves, but we're inherently doing it in some important ways. I won't go through all this, but my paper does. But these are the 5 stages individually we go through. It's called negative motivated reasoning that help us kind of stay with the decisions we've already made. So first, what do we even expose ourselves to? What sources do we go to? We normally inherently go to sources that we know are going to support us, ignore those sources that are going to challenge us. The Facebook and Google does this for us if you don't even know that you're doing it. Then how we actually interpret new evidence. Confirmation bias is probably one of the most important concepts from the last year. This election was confirmation bias on steroids. And then once we have that evidence, we make sense of evidence by telling stories, putting them together. How we tell those stories and make attributions, there's a lot of bias in there. And then how we finally actually make the decisions. And scarily, even what we remember is really kind of influenced by bias. We think personal memory is, but we go through all those kind of stages, and this is one of my favorite quotes from the book, is this notion that when we really want to believe something, we ask ourselves, can I believe it? And if we find just one little shred of evidence that supports it, we're done and we're happy, right? But if we don't want to believe it, we ask ourselves, must I believe it? And if we find just one little bit of evidence that goes against it, once again, we're done and we're happy and we've challenged ourselves. Right? So that leads to this important notion, which is going to be particularly important potentially today. We resist counter-evidence. One way to think about the research is showing is once we've made a decision and once we're polarized, facts don't change people's minds. YouTube videos don't change people's minds. Clever memes don't change people's minds. Research actually shows the higher quality your evidence when you're attacking someone, the more it will backfire, because their brain has to work that much harder to overcome it, right? We all believed in the holy grail of the informed citizen and just more evidence will change minds. That's not how our brains work. So we had to figure out other ways of changing people's minds versus just throwing facts at them. And then last, we avoid value dilemmas, tensions, and tough choices. For someone who does all their work in wicked problems, this is a problem, right? Because the exact thing that we need to be engaging, our brains are designed not to engage. Now, in this, that's an individual people. You get a pretty big blinder on. You're seeing kind of one side of the issue. And then what happens, you try to talk to other people that you disagree with. And it doesn't go well, right? Think about Facebook conversations about the election. Think about going home to Thanksgiving and seeing that cousin you haven't seen in a while that thinks a little bit differently than you. There's actually a really nice TED Talk you can look for from Karen Schultz on being wrong. But she talks about when someone's really pushing us and someone's trying to convince us we're wrong, we're interacting with someone with those opposite blinders on, we make these assumptions. The first assumption is an ignorance assumption. We assume they just don't know what I know, right? If they had the information I had, they would think like me, right? So we give them the information we have, and they don't change their mind, right? So then we have to move on to the idiot assumption, right? They're just not very smart, right? So they have the information, but they don't know what to do with it. If they were smarter, they would think like me, right? But then you interact with them, and they seem pretty smart, right? So then you have to make a third jump. And she calls it the evil assumption. I think that's a little strong, but I think the main point here with this assumption is you're shifting to assuming ulterior motives, right? That they know, and they even maybe know you're right, but they're going to stick to their guns because some other kind of reasons. And that's a pretty big shift, because when we get to that shift, communication breaks down. There's no reason to have a conversation with someone who's not being honest and who's kind of hiding ulterior motives, right? And that kind of creates a pretty big breakdown. And that's the problem with wicked problems, is if we have bad process with wicked problems, it inherently creates this kind of vicious cycle of polarization that kind of builds on itself. And again, the 2000 election is kind of an example of that. So now the good news. All that stuff is when we have a tough issue, we've already made our mind up, those kind of processes kind of feed themselves and create a lot of polarization. The good news, going back into all this research, is we are inherently social and seek purpose and community. We're not self-interested that much. We want to connect. Going back to the notion that we're tribal, the big question becomes, who's our tribe, right? Now, the problem is tribal is really easier to kind of good versus evil, right? But it doesn't have to be that. So clearly, nationally, our tribes are Democrat and Republican. Those aren't working so well right now, right? Those are very divisive. Looks back earlier today, but going back to the 1800s, the tribe of Fort Collins and Greeley might have some issues, right? But in this room right now, maybe our tribe is the Poudre watershed, right? And we're all one tribe, and like we just heard from the panel, we've got a lot of things that we agree on. And if we can see ourselves not as opponents from these individual kind of things, but as collaborators trying to work through these differences, we can tap into the good of our tribal nature and kind of avoid the bad of that, right? We are inherently pragmatic and creative. This is probably the defining feature of the human species, right? But this is a potential we can tap into if we don't get stuck in the muck of all those other kind of things, right? So once we kind of tap in and start kind of these collaborative processes and build a culture, we can tap into that. And then last, we can't overcome our bad tendencies and build better habits. We can kind of overcome those kind of natural tendencies of human nature, and we can build these kind of collaborative cultures. And that's certainly a lot of the work that the CBD and a lot of work that Mary Lou's group has been trying to do with this, right? The problem is most of our public processes basically tap into all the bad stuff and not the good stuff, right? So especially when it's just a process, it just collects an individual opinions, right? So what we need is more productive, interactive conversations, and to tap in, to develop better process that works with the ways our brains kind of want to work. And that's, again, the work that the CBD tries to do. So the bottom line of the good news is, what actually changes people's minds? A real conversation with someone that they respect. So we need to start figuring out ways of creating the opportunities for people to have real conversations with people they disagree with, but hopefully through that conversation kind of build some respect. And this is actually a picture from Spring 11 when we had the Poudre discussions with my students kind of helping with that, right? So with that, we're going to go into these small group discussions here. So we have some rules of engagement kind of based on kind of this theory as we go to these tables, that to be respectful of other people's views, and part of this is pragmatic, right? If you just scream at someone and throw them evidence, it's just going to backfire, right? What's going to work is actually listening to them and asking them good questions, because they'll probably reciprocate as they kind of go through. Listen for understanding, not to how to counter another's point, right? So don't listen for the flaw to expose, but listen for the reasons you can understand them. Be succinct, don't talk too much. Encourage others to share their view, and hopefully they'll be doing the same. And then last, it's okay to disagree, just do so with curiosity, not hostility. We have some real disagreements. I think a lot of times our disagreements are exaggerated because of the polarization, because of our blinders. We actually, again, have a lot more we agree with than we think, and good conversations can kind of bring that out. So with that, grab your clickers. We're going to ask 3 quick questions here, and the questions are going to be kind of what spark your conversations here. That will give you about 15, 20 minutes of conversation. Yeah. And Mary Lou's team kind of developed these questions and the answers to them. And for these, you're doing something a little bit different. You're going to pick your top 3 in order. So you're going to have 3 questions, read the answers, and then decide which ones, and then just pick 3. The first one you pick is the most important, second most important, third, and it's a little weighted average, so it'll give you kind of get a sense of the room, right? So what is the most important to you about the Poudre River? A, it's good for local economies. B, it's one of the most beautiful and biologically diverse natural environments in northern Colorado. C, it provides recreational opportunities. D, it supplies water for agriculture. And E, it supplies water for municipal and industrial needs or other. So again, you're going to pick your top 3. If you pick a 4th, it's going to forget your first one, right? And if you don't know what you did so far, just start over. As long as you pick 3, it's going to count those 3. If you actually click the button on the bottom that has like the number and the percentage, that little button, it'll change, because the percentages don't actually mean much here since you were picking 3. But the number 1 was B. The most votes were for it's a beautiful and biologically diverse. And looks like what supplies water for agriculture was second, supplies water for municipal and industrial needs was third, but all of them certainly got at least some votes there. We'll come back to this. What concerns you most about the Poudre River? Same thing, your top 3 choices. So general public does not have a good understanding of the rights of agriculture and urban diverters and why they're important. The general public does not have a good understanding of the Poudre River health and why it's important. Proposed storage projects may take away too much from Poudre's flows. Agriculture is threatened with dry up as cities change more water in urban uses, or other. So that second one got the most votes. The general public does not have a good understanding of the Poudre River health and why it's important. Second was public doesn't have an understanding of the rights of agriculture and urban diverters. And a third, kind of all of them kind of up there again. Quite a few got votes throughout there. Right? And then a few others that you might be able to share your table. And then last question before we go to small groups, what gives you hope for the Poudre River? Municipal water providers are seeing success in reducing per capita per day usage. B, the general public seems to be increasingly aware of the precarious state of water in the West. C, environmental and agricultural stakeholders seem to be communicating better about the Poudre than in the past. D, we're doing more to improve the river's ecological health than ever before. E, young people seem to be more aware of the importance of sustainable water practices than earlier generations. Or F, I have very little hope for the future of the Poudre River. So with that, we're going to send to the tables here, probably 15, maybe a little bit more, go through. Mainly just kind of reacting to the day overall, but particularly reacting to these 3 questions. So I'll kind of keep on cycling through these questions so you can kind of look at everyone's answers. And then we'll have a little bit of time afterwards for a report out. But I'll kind of tell you, the report out will be a little different. Instead of handing you the microphone for you to kind of speak your thing, we're going to ask you, we'll hand out the microphone, something that you learned from someone else at your table, something that you heard today that you think was pretty important, right? Or you can nominate someone else at your table to talk, but instead of giving you the microphone, we really want to kind of hear through this process. When we go into a conversation, not to win an argument, but go in the conversation to refine our opinions and to learn from other people, what do we learn from that, right? All right, we're going to come back to the whole group here. We got about 5 minutes to hear some really quick kind of report outs before I turn it over to Reagan. So I'm going to walk around, hopefully just some quick hitters. I'd love just to hear some aha moments, something that you heard that maybe changed a little bit of the way you think, or something that you think other people should know. So I'm just going to kind of Donnie Hewitt, walk around the table, and hopefully 15, 30 seconds each, we can get maybe 10 people in here the next 5 minutes.
Our table had an interesting discussion. We were looking at sort of the Poudre River holistically, and that all the water is essentially spoken for, and so really it becomes a resource allocation issue. How do you share what's here? How do you optimize the hydrology resources that are here? And really it quickly gets into what are the impediments from doing that. And we got as far as sort of 2 impediments. One is sort of communication, and I think this forum is a standing way to improve the communication over how can we better allocate the resource and what are the needs, and is it better to have 1,000 acres of corn or feedlots, or is it better to have 1,000 acre feet of additional water for future municipal growth, or is it better to have 10 CFS in the river? And so we just need to continue the dialogue to share that. But the real problem, or the other impediment that we got as far as identifying, was sort of a trust issue of how do you, if you do agree to temporarily or on some conditions share what you think is yours, how do you trust that you will get it back when you really need it? And that's about as far as we got.
Well, I had the pleasure of having Harold Evans at my table, who is the chair of the Greeley Water Board. So, plethora of information. And if you weren't paying attention earlier today at his presentation, there's a lot of history that goes into our relationships and how we have now developed our new tactics to kind of work together, learning from our historical mistakes to kind of push forward to make sure we're using our resources in the best availability. So, yeah, thank you, Harold.
I think our table feels that for the residents, water is just too cheap. And as it was said earlier, things don't change until there's maybe a price tag, even for the citizens of municipalities.
So our table talked a little bit about the fact that so many people on this slide thought that the beautiful and biologically diverse natural environments in northern Colorado were really important. And somebody at our table, Kurt, mentioned something that I didn't know before, and so I'm glad I learned this, that apparently we are biologically wired to love rivers and water and to appreciate rivers as part of our biology. So I thought that was a pretty cool fact.
We talked about the growth, picking up on some of the earlier discussion, and the need to link that to land use planning and policies, which we didn't get into a lot today, I think by design, but that is, I don't think water comes first in that discussion and growth. It's land use and things like that first.
So I guess our group, we talked about exporting water, looking at cattle or also the production of crop for cattle, moving that outside of the watershed versus in-stream uses for environmental purposes regarding aquatic ecosystem health.
With that, I'll turn it over to Reagan. I'll just make one last point at the end, going back to kind of one of the positive features of human nature, that we are kind of natural, kind of creative problem solvers. My concern with a lot of the work that I do, kind of more politics, is we use a lot of that creativity focused on basically making the other side look bad, right? And if we redirect that, instead of focusing on winning and kind of creating these good versus evil stories, and focus it on how can we work together to be creative, then we get at a lot more of these answers that we've been talking about. So thank you.
Martine, great job. That was really